This week on the Wheelhouse. It's 2025, and a familiar face is back in the White House. What might that mean in Connecticut and beyond? For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. A lot happened in America in 2024. Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt in July. By November, he was president-elect. President Joe Biden was on the Democratic ticket until he wasn't. And Vice President Kamala Harris became the first woman of color to become a major party presidential nominee. Here in Connecticut, residents voted to remove restrictions to absentee voting, and state lawmakers grappled with climate whiplash, floods and droughts within the span of a few weeks. Wow, 2024 really was a lot. But now that we've entered a new year, it's time for us at the Wheelhouse to set our sights on the future. So to help us do that, we brought the Wheelhouse to the people last week. We were joined at Connecticut Public by a powerhouse panel of experts, surprise guests, and a studio audience. This hour, we're bringing the sights and sounds of this action-packed show to you. So without further ado, let's meet our first surprise guest. She is the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Connecticut, Susan Bysiewicz. Hi, Lieutenant Governor. Thank you so much for coming on. Welcome to our great crowd here.
Fabulous.
80 strong. 80 strong here in Hartford.
I love it.
Take a seat right here.
Okay.
All right, so Lieutenant Governor Bysiewicz and state lawmakers recently got to work at the Capitol.
We did.
Before you did that, we had a U.S. presidential election. So that's kind of creating the temperature for where we are right now as you guys get back to work. So there's some ongoing debate between Republicans and Democrats nationally about the state of the economy. How do you think things are going? How are things going in Connecticut?
Excellent. We are working on our 7th balanced budget. We have given $1 billion in tax cuts over the past 2 years to help working and middle class people. We've paid down $8 billion in debt, which has allowed us to invest $700 million every year in things that uplift people, like early childhood education, job training, free community college, and we have a very robust rainy day fund, because if it should happen that we have massive federal funding cuts, to me that's a rainy day. And so, if Medicaid should go away or other programs, we are in a good position in Connecticut. And as a matter of fact, the governor has just said that we have an extra $1 billion on top of what we spent in last year's budget to invest in Connecticut. And so we know there's a lot of needs. We know we have 5,500 homeless people in Connecticut, 500 who are kids. We know we have very hardworking nonprofits that do important work for families.
And they're going to be asking you for money very shortly.
Oh, they already started. Don't you worry. They've already started.
Let's drill in a little bit on the national situation, because it is kind of deciding where we are here in 2025. There's a lot of talk. You're a member of the Democratic Party. There's a lot of talk about there being a fracture in the Democratic Party. What do you want to say about the state of your party right now?
Well, so nationally we have work to do. However, I would say the Democratic Party in Connecticut is really strong, and here's why I say that, because we picked up 6 Democratic state representative seats and an additional state Senate seat in the chamber where I preside, the state Senate. And all of our Congress people, including Jahana Hayes, who was one of the top targeted races in the country, won by a very strong margin. Chris Murphy was returned to office, and Kamala Harris got a good chunk of the vote. So I think the Democratic Party is doing very well in our state because we have been laser focused on wallet and pocketbook issues, right? Kitchen table issues. We know there are a lot of challenges with utility rates, with grocery prices, gas prices, housing costs are just out of control. So we've tried to really focus on the things that make a difference for families.
Nationwide, Donald Trump has been in 3 elections, and 2 of them were against women. This most recent election, he defeated Kamala Harris. I know you very much were invested in that race. You were hoping that Kamala Harris would win that. I want to zoom back a little bit and talk about perspective and whether or not you're concerned that a female president could break through the glass ceiling and actually win one of these races quite shortly.
So I think they can, although 4 out of 10 Americans told the AP pollsters that they think it's not likely. I'm optimistic. We have a bench, but it's not big enough. We have 28% of our United States Congress members are women. We have 25% of our U.S. senators who are women. We have 13 out of 50 female governors. So we need a bigger bench because who can run for president? Usually U.S. senators or governors. And sadly, there were a lot more men in the pipeline than women. What Hillary Clinton said famously was the presidency is the highest and hardest glass ceiling, right? But she put 2.9 million cracks in the glass ceiling. And I think with more females in our Congress and our Senate and governor seats, we will have a better opportunity, and I think Gretchen Whitmer would be a great candidate.
Yeah, I was going to say, so give me a name. So talk more about why you think Gretchen Whitmer would be a candidate.
Look, she's a governor who's been very successful in the middle of our country. She took a state that was red and turned it blue. She's created a whole lot of green jobs in the state of Michigan. We need someone who is a Democratic candidate who can bring people together. And I think that if we had some good candidates from the middle part of the country, we might have a good chance of doing that.
Less people voted overall in Connecticut this time around compared to 4 years ago. But Donald Trump did get more of the vote share this time around. Is there a message you have to anybody that might have either flipped, I think 14 towns or something like that, flipped in Connecticut? Is there a message you have to those folks?
Oh my goodness, I would just say this. I am the daughter of a veteran. Anyone who has ever had a family member who has served in one of the branches of our United States military just owes it to those family members. They put their lives on the line so we could be choosing our leaders. Please take every opportunity you have to exercise your right to vote.
You talked about Medicare. I know there's some concern over education funding, particularly after ARPA dollars were all accounted for. So just give me an idea of something that you're looking for from the next administration. Maybe you're looking at a cut, or maybe you're looking to make an appeal to the next administration.
Well, we want to make sure that our families have what they need. So that means we need Social Security, we need Medicaid, we need Medicare, we need our federal agencies. And so I hope that cooler heads will prevail and Connecticut will receive more federal funding than we've received in the past.
Lieutenant Governor Bicewicz, I've got a live crowd here tonight. 84 people, something like that. Give yourselves a loud applause. I want to see if I could do something here. Can somebody share a buzz phrase or 2 words that we hear about when we hear about local politics? Fiscal guardrails. Stand up. Thank you so much. Fiscal guardrails. It's a very important phrase. You talked about them earlier. That's going to be a big part of the next session here in Connecticut. So tell me about that and any attempts that you and the governor can have to kind of maybe use some of that reserve funds. I know there's going to be people pounding on your doors at the Capitol to try to access some of that money, but what do you think?
There's already been a stream, and actually that's what the legislative process is all about. People are going to have the opportunity, whether it's nonprofits, whether it's local leaders, mayors, and first selectmen, whether it's educational institutions, UConn, the state colleges and universities, are going to have the opportunity to come before the legislature and make their case. And then ultimately, what we do together, the governor and the legislature, will let the people of Connecticut know what our priorities are, and those priorities will be in our budget. And I just want to stress that we have increased aid to municipalities. We have increased aid for our state higher education institutions every year since we've been in office. So to the point where municipalities have received double this past year than they had when we started back in 2019. We've been increasing aid, and we have an extra $1 billion on top of an extra revenue. So let's have a conversation about what's most important to people.
So if you do get more money, because I know there's a lot of talk about maybe the volatility cap, things like that. I'm not asking exactly what's going to happen, but just give me an idea where that money would go if you do find some extra money. You would think it would go to the towns, maybe through ECS, or
I think
any idea yet, just to help us get some color
I
here
think it depends. I think education is always a huge issue. Housing is going to be a big part of the conversation. And I remember being in the Senate chamber, and everything stops at midnight on the last day of the session. And at 5 of 12, there were housing bills still being debated, and we never got to a consensus. So we'll see what happens on that.
I know how much you care about women in government. We just talked about nationally. We talked about locally. I had you on the show about a year ago, and we talked about your role on the Governor's Council on Women and Girls. I wanted to make sure I got the council correctly.
Council on Women and Girls, absolutely.
One of the things you said that would support women locally was if you put up a woman candidate as governor in 2026. Should Governor Lamont choose to run again, would you support him? Could you be the woman that runs? Help me understand that.
Well, first let me say, if the governor would like to run for a third term, I would be right there. I love working with him. We, I think, have done a good job for the state, and I would be very proud to continue. Honestly, it's not about the office, it's about the work. And I feel like we've done a lot of great work for women and families to raise the minimum wage to over $16 an hour, just went up to $16.35 at the beginning of January. That has uplifted 170,000 families that are headed by women. You know, it's a myth that only teenagers make minimum wage, not true. 190,000 families have made use of our paid leave program. So we've done a lot of good work together, and the governor has said he's going to make a decision about his plans after this session, and then we'll see.
I hope you don't turn off my show when you listen to it, the Wheelhouse. But if anybody wants to do it, it might be because they say that politics can be negative. So we're trying to strike a hopeful tone, a positive tone today. So leave us with something that you're hopeful for in the year 2025.
So it's sort of hard to pick. So I'm going to say independence and peace in Ukraine, peace in the Middle East, and a three-peat for the Husky men and a national championship for Husky women. How about that?
The basketball capital of the world, also yes. The pizza capital of the world, but I don't want to talk about that too much because I'm hungry. Lieutenant Governor Susan Bysowitz, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
You're getting up. We would like Ollie to find a new home. I'm going to sign this, and I'm going to ask you to sign it as well. Okay. This could be like a sick memorabilia item for somebody here tonight.
Oh my goodness!
It's going to be signed by the both of us.
It goes with your purple shoes.
All purple every day. Here you go. You sign that.
Okay.
And then we're going to have you pick somebody to give it to.
Oh.
Who would like Ollie? Who would like the next Ollie?
Oh my gosh!
Come on over here. Come on over here. To our friend over here. Thank you so much for coming to the show tonight, Lieutenant Governor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was the Lieutenant Governor. We appreciate her coming on. More surprise guests to come, but first, our powerhouse panel. Yeah, come on out. Hello, so good to have you. I want you guys to sit down and get comfortable. First, I have WFSB News Channel 3 Chief Political Reporter Susan Raff.
Thank you.
We love Susan. And we love Bilal Siku, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Hartford. We're waiting.
Go Hawks.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, Mark Pazniokis, the co-founder of the Connecticut Mirror and, of course, the Capitol Bureau Chief there. We only have the best on our show, and these are three of the best. We're regularly talking on the show. I'm wondering, Susan, I'll start with you first, if you have any reactions to what you just heard from the Lieutenant Governor.
Well, I think, she painted a very positive picture. She is right. This election was very good to Democrats. We had the strongest Democratic majority in the House and the Senate, I think, for the first time in 48 years. I wouldn't say that the state is doing that well. I think we have some work to do, but I think she highlights some of the things that are important in Connecticut, which voters feel is important, but we have a ways to go with housing and education. I think this week we heard Senator McCrory, who's on the Education Committee, say, we have some of the best schools, but we have some of the worst schools, right? So there's a huge disparity, I think, between cities and suburbs, and we need to work on that.
What do you say about the picture that the Lieutenant Governor painted here, Paz?
It's an accurate picture. I mean, Connecticut has been doing better, but there are still significant challenges. There is a conflict that is going to play out in the next few months between Governor Lamont and really more members of his own party about whether or not the various spending caps, the fiscal guardrails, will be revised.
There it is, drink. Some water.
In fact, the governor's staff is really, they tell him don't use fiscal guardrails anymore, but he can't help himself. He used it a couple of times this morning talking to CBIA.
It's easy enough.
Where he actually made some news. He said the spending cap, which is really one of three statutory caps, that the spending cap is sacrosanct. That means there's going to be a little bit of give, perhaps, on the volatility cap, which the volatility cap is certain revenues that historically have been volatile, that above a certain level you have to basically put them in the piggy bank and pay down the bonding debt and pay down the pension liability. But he indicated may have a wee bit of flexibility in dealing with the Democratic leadership of the General Assembly on at least that aspect of the fiscal guardrails.
I threw her a fastball there, up and tight there in the zone, and I wanted to know whether or not she would continue to support the governor. Maybe she would run. What do you think about that response? It sounds like maybe 4 more years of Lamont in Connecticut. At least that's who the Democrats might put up.
Oh, as charming as you are, did you think she would come on the show and say, I'm going to run?
Nobody's going to challenge Ned Lamont, the Democratic Party, for the gubernatorial nomination, who has any chance of winning a nomination. So, I mean, that's just a non-starter. So she has to answer it that way. William Tong answers that question that way. But, Lieutenant Governor Bicewicz is out getting conditional commitments where they're available for support for her if Ned Lamont does not run in 2026.
I think she'll absolutely run if he decides not to.
Yeah.
If he doesn't run, I think Game of Thrones will look nothing like what we'll see in Connecticut. There are a lot of people who are lined up who want that job. And so I think, certainly it may be a headache for the Democratic Party if he decides not to run, because there are a lot of people who want that job.
I asked about the glass ceiling and whether or not a woman could break through it, or one that she would pick to be president. And her first name that she mentioned was Gretchen Whitmer. It wasn't Kamala Harris. And at least in the final days of his presidency, it seems like Joe Biden is focusing on his legacy. He's focusing on Joe Biden and not necessarily on members of the Democratic Party. But I'm not sure that we're getting the idea that Kamala Harris may have had the full support of the Democratic Party, or if it mattered anyway.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that she's actually decided that she's going to retire from politics either. So she may throw her hat back in the ring again.
Oh, she has another 35 years, it sounds like,
she's
when we're looking at some of our other candidates.
Exactly. I mean, she's young by comparison to to both Trump and Biden. But I think certainly depending on what part of the country you're in, the Democratic Party is facing more difficulties than others. And so I think certainly if you're looking at a place like Florida, you're looking at parts of the South and certainly flyover country, the other Midwest, that's bad territory in terms of their ability to win. But I think at the same time, the autopsy on this election, I think, has really sort of overestimated just how popular MAGA is and Donald Trump is. At the end of the day, he won that election by about 1.5%, right? He received 49.9% of the vote. The bigger problem that Kamala Harris faced and the Democrats face at the national level, and we saw evidence of that here in Connecticut, is that turnout among anti-MAGA voters who showed up in 2020, they didn't show up in 2024. His base didn't grow that much. Yeah. It was basically where he was at in 2020. The problem is she saw probably one estimated about 15 million people who had voted in 2020 didn't show up this time around and vote. And so that is certainly a problem that Democrats have to deal with. And we saw evidence of that here in Connecticut and our major cities. I mean, the turnout rates in places like Hartford and Bridgeport were really bad, and they had been in a steady decline. It wasn't just in 2024, but if you go back to 16, you see this downward trend in the large cities. And so that really spells trouble, but it also suggests to me that Labor, the Democratic Party, and a lot of the other folks who should be mobilizing people to vote simply were not doing the work that they needed to do in those communities.
Did I get the sense from the Lieutenant Governor that maybe she was saying that at least locally, Democrats are doing a better job of talking about kitchen table issues and the economy than national Democrats are? Did you get that kind of sense if that's what she was saying below?
Clearly that was something that she said. I'm one of the folks who's not completely convinced that the economy was really what explained this election completely. Certainly inflation was a problem. But the 2024 election, one way to look at it is that was the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, the 59th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, and the 56th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. In many ways, I also saw this election as a rejection of what has happened with our country in these last 60 years. We're in a cultural battle in American society. There's a segment of the population that rejects the idea of us becoming a multicultural and inclusive democracy. I mean, I saw when Hegseth was being interviewed before the committee, in the back was this big sign. They spelled military wrong. It was military, but on that sign, DEI. And so I predict over the next 4 years, we're going to see attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're also going to see attacks on transgender rights. We're going to see attacks on a lot of the cultural issues, which I think is really fueling a lot of what is behind Trumpism.
Right, and I don't think the Lieutenant Governor highlighted enough that there's so much uncertainty right now in the state and with the legislature. For example, they have surplus, right, and we're doing well. But how much money do we spend on programs? Do we need money to keep aside in case there are cuts in federal funding? If the fact that we give identification cards to those undocumented people, will that mean that our federal transportation dollars? What about vaccination funding? All of those things. So I think there are lawmakers and the governor who feel it's prudent to hold on because federal funding could be at stake. So there's a lot of uncertainty.
Real quick, Medicare, I think she might have alluded to it, but that's where they're worried that they might have to at least have some money for healthcare costs?
Yeah, the governor has made quite clear that he is terrified at the prospect of the federal government upending this long partnership between the federal and state governments on this 50-50 program that's been so important. And it's really, Medicaid, not Medicare, is the real concern. Right. And Connecticut was one of the states that expanded Medicaid, as was allowed by the Affordable Care Act. And so the concern is if they turn this into a block grant, saying, okay, states, here's the number you get this year, plan around that. We're not going to be tweaking this from year to year. It's a block grant. You figured out how to make it work. This is something that is keeping Ned Lamont up at nights and a significant number of the General Assembly.
And it's something that they're talking about with education, right? So President-elect Trump has talked about disbanding, getting rid of the U.S. Department of Education, and just letting states have give them money. And then the question becomes, well, who's in charge of that money and where does that go? Miguel Cardona, who is the Secretary for Education, a Meriden, Connecticut native.
Meriden's own.
Meriden's own. Talks about the concern that vulnerable students, special needs, those students may not get the services that they need. So it's one thing to say you want to disband and get rid of something because you want to cut back and save money, but how does that work and who's affected by that?
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, we're listening back to The Wheelhouse Live, an annual event where you, our listeners, can join us in studio to get a behind-the-scenes look at our show. We promised our audience surprise guests. Ooh. So before we head to the break, let's listen to someone paving the way for young educators across the state. Ladies and gentlemen, 2025's Teacher of the Year, Julia Miller.
The future is bright. We need to pour resources into our schools so that our young people have what they need, because then they are ready to come and change this world. And also showing that there's so much joy. I think there's a narrative of like teaching, teachers, it's so hard. And it is hard, right? Like we work incredibly hard, but it's also so joyful.
Give me some hopes that you have for 2025.
I hope that our young people in our public schools, no matter their identity, their immigration status, that they are protected and cared for and have opportunities.
Oh my God, Julia Miller, Connecticut's Teacher of the Year. Thank you so much for coming. Stay tuned for more of the Wheelhouse Live after the break. This is The Wheelhouse. From Connecticut Public Radio, I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, you can catch the sights and sounds from The Wheelhouse Live, an event we held at CT Public last week that allowed listeners of the show to actually watch the taping happen in real time. And this was cool. They got to hear about issues they'd actually wrote into us about when they completed our election survey. Oh, it was great. Have a listen. Let's dive into some very current events. Big news happening today. We're talking about a ceasefire deal, but obviously it hasn't been consecrated. We have U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal calling this powerfully heartening and hopeful. This is a sentiment that we're seeing with lawmakers. There's pretty much Democratic lawmakers. That's what we got. We got a full contingent of Democratic lawmakers here in Connecticut in the delegation. They seem to be siding with President Biden on this, but is this more of a positive thing on Biden's legacy, or is it more of a stain? What do you think?
That's a big one. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think a lot of damage has been done. I truly hope that something good can come out of it, but I don't think that Hamas is going to be a responsible partner in this. Terrorism is a serious threat to the modern world. I don't think we can eradicate that. As a Jewish person, I don't know the word that I use of what's been going on. It's very hard for me to look at that. And the lives that have been lost. The area has a history of violence and problems. But I truly hope, I do.
And I think about the hostages, and I think about also the civilians as well. We do want to see the war come to an end. We want to see a ceasefire, but it's not done yet.
Offering instant analysis of anybody's legacy regarding something that's going on in the Middle East, I think is a fool's errand.
That's true too, yes.
We were reminded of all that during the funeral of Jimmy Carter. And I'm sure people are going to draw some parallels to the release of the hostages in Iran on Jimmy Carter's last day in office versus a ceasefire being agreed upon as the Biden administration is winding down. I'm sure there's going to be a debate over which of these presidents deserves any credit. Mr. Trump has said all hell will break loose if this is not resolved by the time he comes in. I think everybody in this room would acknowledge hell and more has broken loose for a long time.
And the work really just starts, and we all hope that the hostages come home, but then what? So there's a lot more.
I think also it's such a troubled region that I don't think we should jump ahead of ourselves on this, right? This is an agreement that has been sort of worked out, but the details need to be, figured out. When you look at a president's foreign policy and you look at Biden's foreign policy, it's very complicated, right? I think historians will look back on Afghanistan and will have lots to say about it in terms of the withdrawal and the way it went. Some will look at that with great disappointment because of the loss of life. Others will say, we were there far too long and needed to get out. And there's no easy way to get out. Vietnam is another great example that you just don't cut and break away and it goes clean. I think historians and others will look back at the Middle East. I've heard some analysis that suggests that something probably could have been worked out even months ago. And the real question is in play is the pressure that Trump is applying and the fact that he is not predictable in terms of what he actually will do. Netanyahu's sort of political considerations for himself, both personally and politically, in terms of those kinds of considerations. Across the globe, people have just been horrified at the level of carnage that's gone on. The rebuilding process, to what extent it will occur in Gaza, will be incredibly costly. It will take many years to do, and tens of thousands of people have lost their lives, in the process. And, on the Palestinian side, and north of 1,000 lives on the Israeli side. And so it deepens the conflict in that region. It deepens the sense of futility that some may feel about peace really coming to the region. And so my heart just goes out to people who are there and who will now try to have to rebuild their lives after this.
This is one issue that is impacting the way that people look at politics. Let's move on to some other issues. Something I've been very proud of is the participation that many of you in the audience joined in on us with. And I think we had something like 750 respondents to our survey that we did right before the election to try to figure out where all of you were and what you needed from Connecticut Public in terms of issues that you cared about. We had 5 issues that were the most talked about issues: climate change, reproductive rights, the economy, democracy, and immigration. Economy, obviously, the most important. Robert Martinez said preserving democracy versus embracing evil. Shannon Weber said saving democracy so we don't fall into authoritarianism. Richard Josa said we have to defend democracy to avoid another January 6th. Bilal, what would you say to these people that seem to really think democracy is something we should be talking about?
One thing I will say about that list, what strikes me about it, it sounds more nationally focused than what I would have thought about within the state of Connecticut. I think, certainly for Connecticut residents, issues like access to affordable housing, energy, transportation, education. Those are the things, when you think about it at a local level, are really the ones that really matter and affect the lives on a daily basis of Connecticut residents. But certainly that plays in, especially democracy. We had a presidential election that just passed. Democracy was in many ways on the table. And 49.9% of Americans decided that they preferred someone who said, day one, I'll be a dictator, who has certainly sent many messages of going after his enemies, attacking the press. There's a long laundry list of things that are quite anti-democratic, right? So understandably, to hear the public center that issue, I think makes a lot of sense.
And pardoning those who participated in violence on January 6th. I think that was a shock to a lot of people, and it makes you think that it could happen again.
Project 2025 seems to be a specter or something hanging over the transition here. It's something we've been talking about. This is what I'm excited about in 2025, is to learn whether or not this is something that there's a correlation to, at least between the Trump administration and the authors of this document. Are you seeing, Paz, anywhere where what we saw with the Heritage Foundation and the writing is sort of mirroring the plans, or is it a boogeyman? What do you think?
It's somewhere in between, I think. The thing about Donald Trump is the challenge in trying to separate the bluster from what the intent really is. Sometimes the bluster is purposeful, it's setting up a negotiation, or it's a misdirection. And these are the things that really are unknown. There are Democratic state administrations all over the country right now who are sort of doing some war games as to how you might respond depending what is that flurry of executive orders. Will there be an effort to mobilize National Guards all around the country to be involved in a mass deportation? It sounds it did sound far-fetched at one point, but these are the things that people are geared up to see in the first hours of the Trump administration, what executive orders actually are put out.
It's important to talk about because a lot of people are obviously concerned about education funding. I think Senator Richard Blumenthal is one of a bunch of lawmakers that have talked to Linda McMahon. Do they have any idea yet? You talked to Miguel Cardona. Does anybody have any idea yet if education is going to become privatized or whatever the term people are throwing around nowadays? What do you think?
I think they don't know, and I think Connecticut is such in the situation where they don't know what's coming down the pike. There are so many uncertainties, and I think what Mark said is very true. A lot of things Trump has said, and you're not sure if it's really going to happen, if he's saying it in the moment, but education is very important, and federal funding is very important for any state. So there are just a lot of uncertainties, and we just don't know.
I guess for me, I'm sort of a believer in what Maya Angelou said. Sometimes you just take people at their word that this is who they are, right? And I think this is who Donald Trump is, and I think he's lined up people in his administration who will carry out what Project 2025 talks about. Will he be able to do it overnight? No. The government is an incredible labyrinth that, it's difficult to work your way through, but I think certainly the intent is there to dismantle government in a way and to get rid of programs. And, in the past, the Democrats and even members of the Republican Party were willing to put stops on certain kinds of things. This party today that's in control of the Republican Party at the national level is about as radical as you can get. And some of the leaders of that party, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others, right? People sort of talk about them as disruptors. I think of them as really being arsonists. They are there to burn the place down. That's what they want to do. That's what they talk about doing. And I think we should take them serious about what their intentions are. Connecticut will be protected in certain ways because of the fact that we're a blue state. But if you are a woman, a trans person, for example, in a state like Florida or Texas or Mississippi, hell will rain down on you in those states because they're already introducing the legislation and they're already moving the agenda in those states. And so the question will be, will you be able to do it across the nation at the same time? Probably not. But in some states, yes, absolutely.
And elections matter. Right, and so in 4 years from now, or people can change and vote someone in, but I think the far more lasting impact will be the Supreme Court. And that is something that will last for generations to come. And that concerns me and a lot of people more, I think, because that's more permanent.
Some of those lawmakers are already trying to, as they say, protect bathrooms on Capitol Hill to try to make sure that the incoming trans lawmaker is not able to access a bathroom. This is something we're going to be paying attention to, and it seems like the Biden administration dropped the ball on in the final days to try to protect some of these rights. Really quickly,
quickly, I'll say, and it's not just what is happening with government. The private sector is also retreating on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
McDonald's,
Walmart, Meta. I mean, and Meta went as far not only to get rid of their diversity, equity, and inclusion program, but to also pull back on trying to, for example, have contractors who are minority-owned businesses. So this is likely something we're going to see as a pattern across the country with a lot of major corporations. And the hope is that here in a state like Connecticut, the governor will send a message to a lot of companies that do business with the state of Connecticut that that's not acceptable here in Connecticut.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. We'll get back to our Powerhouse panel shortly, but before we head to break, listen in on our final surprise guest of the evening. As you'll hear, this one was a big surprise for our studio audience. This person is your personal injury attorney here in Connecticut. She is also the billboard queen here in Connecticut. Ladies and gentlemen, Brooke Goff.
people are normal. Just like what people know about normal is not just man, woman, 2 kids, picket fence. Like, we all have our own version of normal. So what I try to do is bring LGBTQ members out and say, listen, you can have it all. I have it all. I have a wife, I have children, I have a home, I have a very successful business. You can have it all, but they need to see more people like me.
Did you meet Mike Tyson?
Everybody asks if I have a requirement in my world. You have to meet the talent. He knew the billboard said, like, we fight like girls and we win, or like, we knock out the competition. He knew I was going like that. And he's like, hit me. Okay. So, and trust me, if I hit him, I probably would have broke my head. The guy is solid, by the way, solid.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more after the break. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We're doing things a little bit different this hour. We're listening back to a live show we taped last week with a studio audience. The evening was jam-packed with surprise guests, powerful conversations, and flying octopuses. Oh yeah, some lucky guests got to leave the studio that night with our mascot, Ollie the Octopus, in plush form. Man, we had fun. And I hope listening back to it, you are too. Here's the rest of the Wheelhouse live. Thanks for listening. Let's ask about this. We're going to return to our big 5 issues that listeners care about. One being climate change.
The governor had a couple of head-scratching lines in his State of the State speech last week, including a shout-out to natural gas and nuclear power. And the next day, I got a hold of him and he said, what do you want to talk about? I said, I want you to annotate your speech because I can't figure out what the hell you were trying to say.
You said that to the governor?
Yes. We have a good relationship. But really what he was saying, it was a plea to the legislature not to constrain his very limited options because there is a feeling that there will not be enough, the capacity will not be there. So Connecticut is really disadvantaged when it comes to electricity. It's sort of an accident of geography. We are at the end of the line on natural gas pipelines. And it's a real challenge for this administration right now. They're looking at expanding generating capacity, but he's also telling the legislature, both on the left and the right, because the Republicans have proposed pegging the cost of any new procurements on electricity to a certain multiple of what natural gas generated electricity costs. So basically it would be a complicated way of really limited the ability of Connecticut to do offshore wind and other things which right now are more expensive. The governor declined to purchase power from one of the more recent wind procurements. But at the same time, he's saying we have to keep all our options open because there's just not a lot out there.
Just really quickly, you asked the question in the context of climate change, and obviously a lot of the discussion was around energy and how, which is, again, connected. The only thing I'll say about this, when I talk to my students, this is like their number one issue that they really care very deeply about. And their sense that the people who are in charge of the country now does not take seriously enough the threats that climate change presents to us and the effects. I've been in Connecticut since 1995, and I'm just amazed in recent years how mild the winters have been, the lack of snow. Parts of California is on fire right now. The tropical, the hurricane season, when it comes around, the devastation, the intensity of the storms, whether there's a sense of urgency to deal with this in the country that needs to be here, that's a big question mark for me.
Just want to kind of get a sense from the three of you on where you think the next 5 months of the legislative session are going to play out.
Well, I think energy is going to be a big talk of this session. I think housing is, we haven't talked much about that, but that is going to be very big. I think I heard something around 90,000, the lack of units in this state. We can't attract people to Connecticut. We can't keep people here. We can't get our college graduates out of the house unless they can get an apartment.
Oh, boy. That one is a little too close to home for Steve.
Get ready, Frankie.
Literally.
Yeah. And I think energy will be, I don't think though, I think it's not a knee-jerk reaction. I don't think people are going to see their rates go down dramatically. It may not happen at all. It's a long-term. Connecticut has an antiquated infrastructure system. I was at Eversource recently. A lot of transmission lines have to, but energy will be, and I think education too. We're hearing more and more of our schools have very large percentages of special needs students. Those are expensive. We need staffing, we need resources. And if we are going to educate the workforce of the future, we need to do better with our schools. I think those are the top three.
Paz.
There will be another effort at passing a climate bill, which passed the House last year. It failed. It was never taken up in the Senate. And then there was a second bill, which didn't go to climate change, but it's related. It goes to resiliency. And that is likely to be one of the priorities this year. On education, there is a very serious effort to greatly increase special education funding, to have it more of a state function, as opposed to a small town and you have a couple of severely disabled people, and that could be a budget buster the way the laws are written now. So that there's going to be a lot of attention. There's going to be hearings around the state on special education funding and how to change that.
30 seconds to each of you to tell me about what you're looking forward to in 2025 or something else that you might be following.
One of my hobbies is trying to figure out what the future of the Republican Party in Connecticut is, and it'll be interesting to see, again, how they coexist or distance themselves from another Trump administration. The first Trump administration was an absolute disaster for the Republican Party in this state. When Trump took office in January 2017, Republicans held half the seats in the Connecticut Senate. It's down now. It was 25-11 election night. Somebody's resigned, so now it's 25-10. That is a continuing question, as well as what the Democrats will do to really reinvigorate their party in the cities, because that was one of the real stories to come out of that election, was just really how the Democratic Party in Connecticut has become a suburban party. Ned Lamont had a huge re-election victory, despite the fact 2 years ago the cities really didn't turn out for him. But he killed in the suburbs. So these are kind of big picture trends as to what's happening with the identities of these two parties in Connecticut.
I'm looking for people to be less angry, and I'm looking for us all to get off social media as much. I do. I think that is a really big thing. I started teaching recently at Central. I'm an adjunct professor. The information and misinformation and the manipulated information that we see on social media has changed the way that we act towards one another. And I would hope that we could take a break from that. And if TikTok were to be banned, I wouldn't be so upset.
So no social media and no what? and I'm a dreamer.
Or just be careful what you read and take that into a grain of salt, and pick up that New York Times once in a while, that Wall Street Journal, and balance, what your intake of where you get your information.
Agreed.
Less anger.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Powerhouse Panel. Susan Raff, Bilal Siku, and Mark Casio. The Wheelhouse Live. What a great night that was. I'm glad you all got to hear it. The show was produced by my partner in bringing the politics to the people, Chloe Wynn. It was edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken and Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is the maestro Dylan Reyes. Lucy Nalpathanchel put this event together. Thank you so much for yet another successful, sold-out Wheelhouse Live. Special thanks to our operations, visuals, and talk show departments here at Connecticut Public, and much love to Megan Fitzgerald. One more hearty thank you to our Powerhouse Panel, our surprise guests, and you, our fans who bought a ticket to see us. Thank you all so much. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you for listening.